This is a research project that I'm really only just beginning, and I'm doing so with my graduate student, who actually happens to be an international Chinese student, who is going to be doing his PhD on an aspect of this. And what we really wanted to zero in on is looking not so much at bilateral relations, China, state bilateral relations with the Caribbean, but another aspect of the Chinese presence, which is the new sort of private entrepreneurial migration that's occurring. But it turns out, the two of them are very much linked. And so, in order for me to understand what was happening on the ground, we had to, because in fact, those two kinds of presences are simultaneous and they're obviously related to each other. So a lot of what I had in the paper was sort of background information, where I wanted to kind of dramatize the extent of Chinese presence in the Caribbean, and to some extent the recency of it. But I'm going to try to also talk about the true research interest that I have, which is looking at the private entrepreneurial migration. So you can see from this quotation, the last time the American contribution to the Caribbean topped $3 billion was during the Reagan administration some 30 years ago. The U.S. aid in the region today is less than $1 billion. By contrast, the Chinese financial and social contribution to the Caribbean today is more than $6 billion. So I was able to, it's very hard to get exact numbers, but I was able to get these kinds of dramatic statements. So putting them together, I was able to get a picture. So I'm looking at the Chinese presence in terms of two forms, which, as I say, are roughly parallel in time. First of all, the presence, of course, of the Chinese state. And another thing about these figures is that they often don't make a distinction among development assistance, investment, and trade. So, for example, Ronald Sanders recently said that a Chinese official told him that in 2009, China contributed $8.6 billion to the Caribbean. Actually, this is a little less than the figure I saw for Africa. For 2009, it's something like 9 point something billion. And I just couldn't reconcile these two figures. I mean, for the whole of Africa and the Caribbean is the same thing. So it's very hard to know exactly what they mean when they say contribution, right? Chinese contribution. And so it's something that still needs to be done. Anyway, the other form then is the private entrepreneurial migration, which is forming, I'm talking about people who are coming in mostly as small merchants, and they're really entering an entrepreneurial niche. It's a sort of ethnic entrepreneurial niche. And they're making private arrangements to bring in their workers, so that you really can't talk about a sort of proletarian migration, a separate transnational proletarian migration, which some scholars talk about. But what we do know is that the Chinese development assistance is transforming the landscape of the small islands of the Eastern Caribbean, given the Chinese focus on large-scale infrastructural projects. Another problem with the figures is that people often talk about like the Caribbean. So, for example, recently, the Prime Minister of Jamaica made a state visit to China, a 5-day state visit. And one of the things that the headlines in the Chinese newspapers is that the President Xi, said that Jamaica, since 2009, has emerged as China's primary trading partner in the Caribbean. I actually think they mean the Commonwealth Caribbean, because I mean, there's no way that's true with Cuba, right? I mean, it seems to me that China's trading relationship with Cuba is much bigger than that of Jamaica. So I'm just saying that these are some of the problems, when you're just sort of trying to map the field, that kind of stymies getting clear figures. So, yes, so the Chinese development assistance is transforming the landscape of the small islands of the Eastern Caribbean. We're actually looking at the small islands of the Eastern Caribbean in particular, but I want to at least say some things about the whole of the Caribbean. But the Chinese immigrant role in the private sector, although it seems less dramatic in terms of the numbers, because you're really talking about For each island, maybe between, I don't know, 150 to 300 people, and that sounds really small. But of course, you're looking at very small islands with very small private sectors. And the other thing is that we're not talking just any immigrants here, we're talking entrepreneurial immigrants, right? So that makes a huge difference. I think that role is still very transformative. Some background factors. I don't know if I'm ever going to get to the real meat of this stuff because there's so many background factors to consider. I mean, okay, so one of the things we want to, there's an old immigrant presence. There's an old Chinese presence, right? But that's mostly in the larger islands, and that was from the 19th century migrations of indentured laborers, the post-slavery migration of indentured laborers from Asia. So this is completely different. In any event, the islands we're looking at never had that presence in the first place. Cuba was the main destination, but also you have that old Chinese community in Trinidad and Jamaica and places like Guyana. So we are talking about the new immigrant presence, and that's why the literature that I found most compelling was literature from Africa. Where a parallel sort of situation is occurring. Another background factor to take into account is the diplomatic rivalry with Taiwan, right? Despite increasing defections, the Central American and Caribbean region still accounts for roughly half of Taiwan's remaining diplomatic alliances. Although, I mean, since 2008, they talk about there has been a kind of diplomatic détente supposedly between China and Taiwan, where they've agreed not to poach each other's, diplomatic allies. But certainly that was one of the important reasons, I think, or important foundational variables in terms of China's entry into the Caribbean. I mean, when you think even still, with the large islands, I mean, the Dominican Republic, Haiti are still diplomatically allied, not with China, but with Taiwan. It's still certainly a factor. However, so what we're going to do, we're going to look at, we have gone to just 2 islands. We've spent only 2 weeks in each of those 2 islands, so it's really, really preliminary. But we're looking at 2 islands that are allied to Taiwan and 2 allied with China. And we're finding nonetheless that most of the vast majority of immigrants are from the PRC, right? Even in the Taiwan allied islands. And the other background factor that's important is that in terms of the Caribbean as a whole, development assistance and investments are obviously unevenly distributed across the region. So if you start with even Latin America, in fact, over 90% of China's ties with the larger countries of South America have been related to natural resource exports. So you're starting at that level, and then to the level of the tiny islands where there's none of that going on, right? China's presence has only to do with, of course, the diplomatic tie and aid in terms of infrastructural aid, mostly large-scale infrastructural aid. And of course, with the larger Caribbean islands, it's kind of mixed. So with Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, in terms of the Commonwealth Caribbean, you have a mix of both extractive and natural resource investment and aid. Jamaica, for example, China has taken over Jamaica's sugar industry practically, right? So at the same time, Jamaica is one of the most important countries in terms of beneficiaries of China's infrastructural aid. Okay, this is one of the tables. It's hard for you to understand, but basically you can see here that it shows that Latin American and Caribbean exports to China have increased and to the United States have decreased. But that, of course, the U.S., and that's one of the things we have to put into perspective, despite the huge increase in China's presence, the trade relationship, despite the first quotation, which showed that in terms of aid, the U.S. presence has really gone down, we should remember that the U.S. Trade relationship is still much larger than that with China, but that it's going down and that with China is going up. So what are some of these large-scale projects? So you have roads, sports stadiums. I mean, the tiny island of Dominica, where I'm from, which is one of the islands, is supposedly, I think, yesterday in his presentation, Mark was saying that Dominica is, when he pointed out that it's the poorest of the Windward Islands. But I mean, it's it's a man-made landscape. It's practically being transformed by these new large-scale infrastructural projects. So China is building roads. It has built a stadium, a state house. What else? State college. I think it's about to build a hospital. So anyway, these large-scale infrastructural projects include all of these things, including deep water port and airport facilities, which are probably the most expensive infrastructural projects. Investment in extractive and agricultural industries in Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, and Cuba, so involving oil, bauxite, nickel, sugar. So in that regard, it resembles the relationship with South America. Investment in hotels and other tourism-based industries. In the Bahamas, for example, the mega resort, they're building a $3 billion mega resort considered to be one of the largest, in recent times. And it's being constructed by a state corporation. And of course, there's another investment that goes on in the Caribbean, which is investment in the offshore companies. Right? The figures are really startling, and that's another confusion, when you look at the figures. Are they counting in these offshore investments? Because it's absolutely huge. I mean, the figures are surreal. The Caribbean is second to Hong Kong. It's more than the United States, Europe, Africa combined in terms of investments going into China and leaving China, but it's really all in these offshore companies, right? And it's in the Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands are really overseas British territory. So it's really Britain. It's really in Britain, those offshore investments. And of course, but it's often counted. And so it's a source of confusion. In fact, it's some of you may know better than I do, because for me it was new. This phenomenon referred to as round tripping, where basically, you're sort of parking your money in these offshore centers in order to, when it goes back into China, for it to gain the advantages of foreign capital. And in fact, some other scholars are saying that it's more than that, because it actually gets enhanced through the financial processes that take place in the OFCs. In other words, it's not just to gain, the advantages of foreign capital, because in fact, again, in 2008, I think China reduced the advantages, the incentives it had previously given to foreign capital, so that this enhancement in the OFCs, referred to, I think, as institutional arbitrage. I don't know if you've ever heard of, is it arbitrage? I'm not sure. Is what's going on. How much longer do I have?
You have 3 minutes more.
3 minutes more. So, I've only reached the point where I'm actually talking about the purposes of my research. Okay, so this project, which is just starting, the broad purposes are to examine the new role of global China in the Anglophone Caribbean, particularly in the small islands of the Eastern Caribbean, in both of these forms, in the form of bilateral Chinese state development aid and investment, as well as the simultaneous flows of private entrepreneurial Chinese immigrants. That's really over just the last 15 to 20 years. And as I said before, the targeted focus of the research nonetheless is, okay, I'm going to just go quickly over there. I don't think I'm... Okay. I have... it looks like there's a lot of context. I'm doing a lot of contextualization. Anyway, let's just go through that. So China's, the contemporary context, there are certain factors that we have to keep in mind. One, of course, is China's outbound state capitalism and growing role as a global development agent, particularly in the countries of the global south. From the Caribbean end, this sort of post-neoliberal development vacuum. as in many countries of the global south, and the relative attractiveness of the Chinese development assistance model. And I think we've heard about this from different people here. The concessional loans, the grants, for example. In the Caribbean as well, there's some incentives, of course, to pull in foreign capital. And one of the interesting things in a couple of the islands is something called economic citizenship programs, which people always remind the critics that you have it in Canada, you have it in the United States, and so the Caribbean islands are not the only ones, but it's a way of sort of pulling in some of these immigrants. And however, we found out, my student and I found out that in St. Kitts, some of these private entrepreneurs, immigrant entrepreneurs, had used the economic citizenship program. In other words, I don't know, in St. Kitts, I think you pay $500,000 and you can get a condominium and citizenship, instantaneous citizenship. In fact, they're selling citizenships, and people are actually coming back. Like, I know a couple friends of mine who were lawyers and lived outside, coming back into St. Kitts and opening up their own citizenship granting offices. So, I'm just wondering at this point, with very little time, what I should... I looked at the African literature and essentially looked at both the, because it's almost an identical thing happening in Africa, right? With the investment, the infrastructural assistance, as well as the investment in natural resources, and then the private entrepreneurial streams. So in terms of the literature, there are three main forms that Chinese aid and investment take: the large infrastructural projects. I feel as if I'm repeating a little bit. I could have actually advanced much further by removing some of these slides. Roads, stadiums, presidential palaces, utilities, telecommunications, transportation systems, schools, housing projects, and of course the large-scale direct investment in oil and minerals. And then in Africa, you also have the state-assisted, semi-private, private investment in large-scale manufacturing concerns that are networked with China's economy. And those are private because the state doesn't have investment in manufacturing typically. There are also three main forms that immigration takes. And maybe since I'm out of time, we can talk maybe in the discussion section on how the Caribbean might differ from these forms. Temporary contractual migration, and that has to do, of course, with the large, China imports, as you all know, China imports its workforces on these large infrastructural projects. So that's what they're referring to here as temporary contractual migration. Private entrepreneurial migration, and in Africa, a proletarian transit migration, which we definitely don't have in the Caribbean. As I was saying, these small immigrant merchants, they have, through their private arrangements, they procure their labor forces, and we're talking, each establishment having maybe, I don't know, for the most up to about 10 or 20 Chinese workers. And so they make private arrangements, and that's one of the things that the local private sectors are quite angry about, the failure to observe labor laws and so on. And that's one of the things I was going into. I was going to talk about our research, what we found when we did interviews with the private sector in those islands, but I am out of time. So for what it's worth, this is my presentation. Thank you.